So in the second part of this class on personal property, on tangible property, we'll explore personal property. Now, personal property is very different to real property in very fundamental respects. Land is permanent and immovable, whereas personal property can move in lots of different places, very mobile. And so as such, there's no comprehensive system for publicly registering title to personal property, as there is with real property. There are some specialized agencies, specialized registries that deal with, for example, your car or patents or trademarks. But in the main, you're not necessarily going to find a registry system for small items that you are purchasing. Now, that's very significant for the risks associated with purchasing this property, because you can't necessarily guarantee the title to that property. Now, you can possess personal property and you can own personal property. So they're very different in law, actually, and we need to explore what this in fact means. The separation between possession and ownership is very significant. So you can, if you're leasing a property or loaning a property, you don't own that property. If you lease a car, you don't own the car, actually. But you have possession of that car. You have the right to make use of that car, for example. You can be in possession, if you are a storage company, you possess that person's property for that specific period, but you don't own that property itself, actually. You can use personal property as collateral for a loan, and then under those circumstances, the person has possession, has control of the property, but they don't own the property, and that's very significant. So we need to think about what are the obligations of the non-owners in possession of that property. Now, in the main, the non-owner that has possession has a requirement to take reasonable care, and that's irrespective of whether or not there's a contractual arrangement or not. Typically there should be, but even if there wasn't, the non-owner that's in possession, if you loan your friend a car, you'll have an obligation to take reasonable care of that property. If you're an owner and you are in possession, you can sell or transfer that property, and you can in fact lease that property as well. You can use your property as security for a loan, and you can transfer possession of your property for the purpose of storage or repair. If you go and take your car into the repair shop, you have the right to do that, actually, as the owner of the car. Now, this arrangement is the law of bailment, actually, and this is very interesting for us to consider, in fact, because this occurs all the time in your daily life, actually. A bailment refers to, in law, it's the temporary transfer of possession of personal property from one person to another. Now, this happens in many different ways. For example, if you take your clothes to the dry cleaner, for example, a bailment is created, actually, and under those circumstances, you've transferred possession of your shirt, for example, to the dry cleaner for the purposes of cleaning it, for example. But it also occurs if you lend a friend a car, or you leave your car for repairs, for example, or you pay to store your car. In bailment, there are typically two parties. The bailor is the person who owns the property and is transferring possession of that property to somebody else, and that somebody else is referred to as the bailee, and that person is the person who's receiving possession of that property. Now, this is very significant. Who the bailor is and who the bailee is very important, because what happens is it will depend on whether or not the obligations associated with this contract of bailment will depend very greatly on whether or not the bailment is for value or it is a gratuitous bailment. Now, if the bailment is for value, then there is going to be a higher standard of care. We learned about different standards of care in the law of tort, actually. And so if the bailments are value, if you're paying somebody, then they have a higher standard of care in relation to a gratuitous bailment. So for example, if you leave the room and you ask somebody to watch your laptop, you didn't pay them, for example, they don't have the same standard of care as if you were to take your laptop to a repair shop in order to have it fixed, for example. And so this is actually very significant for us to think about. So you can think about bailment is a generic form of many different, that applies to many different business transactions. Now, in a typical bailment contract, there will be services that are provided by the bailee, the person who receives possession of the bailment, and that's the price to be paid by the bailment and the payment terms. And the extent to which the bailee will be liable for damage or loss. So for example, if you take your clothes to the dry cleaner on the ticket stub, you'll probably see something like, we're only limited our liability to, let's say, $200. That is a way of the dry cleaner managing their risk in relation to your particular item that you are granting possession to them. But let's say for example, you're sending in your wedding dress, which is worth much more than $200, for example. What happens then? Well, if it's the case that you make clear to your dry cleaner that this is your wedding dress and it costs this much, and this is what will happen if the dress is damaged, under those circumstances, it would be foreseeable that the dry cleaner knew or was aware of the special circumstances that the bailor had, in fact, and would be liable for the full amount. So we need to think about what the remedies are for parties that fail to perform. Let's say, for example, you take your car into the repair shop and you don't pay. What happens then? If you're a bailee, so you're the person who is taking possession of the property, you are going to attempt to mitigate or reduce or minimize your risk by contract. If there's no contract in place, then you have an ordinary standard of care, but you can limit that through contract. If you have special circumstances, so for example, if you're a specialized carrier and you've been given instructions by the bailor regarding the value of the goods, then that will increase or expose you to greater liability. Also, indeed, if you are an expert bailee, so for example, if you are involved with, for example, having a pet store, for example, you are actually a specialized bailee, for example, because you are in the business of taking care of animals, actually. Under those circumstances, you will have increased liability, greater than, for example, if you take your cat or dog to your neighbor's house, for example. So with the bailor, the person who gives their property to another, they warrant that the goods are fit for the purpose for which they are bailed. So for example, let's say you own a ski shop and you're renting out skis to interested skiers. You will warrant that the skis that you are renting or loaning are fit for the purpose for which they are bailed, that is to say, for skiing. So that is something that will be implied in that contract. Bailments occur for repair. Those are typically, for example, if you're taking your shoes in for repair, for example. But let's say you take your shoes to get resold, and you don't want to pay. For example, you think it's too expensive. What happens then is the bailee, the shoe maker, shoe owner, it will not be able to, doesn't own the property at that point. They have an interest in the property, or they have a lien. That is to say, they have a right to retain possession of your personal property until payment is received. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean they can destroy your property at all, but it does mean that they have the right to retain possession until you pay. But they still have to take reasonable care of your property, even though you've not yet paid. In the case of bailment for transportation, common carriers typically, or people that are, let's say, FedEx, have a very high standard of care for the property that they are transporting. And part of the reason for this, there's no way of the bailor being able to monitor the activity of their goods in transit. And so for that reason, we place a very high standard of care on common carriers. Under those circumstances, the owner is not required to prove fault. So it would be the case that if the item is lost or damaged in transport and it should have been tracked, then the common carrier should be liable for that. What I'd like you to do for next class is go through this problem question, which I provided for you. It explores these issues of real and personal property. What you'll be doing here is identifying the legal issue to be solved, applying the relevant law that you've learned in class and in these lectures, and then drawing a conclusion. You'll do that for every issue that you observe in this problem. That's it for this class, and I'll see you in the next session.